You would have smelled the scriptorium before you saw it, a peculiar combination of oak gall ink, animal fat from candles, and the faintly sweet musk of stretched parchment. The room at Lindisfarne Priory sat on the second floor of the stone monastery, positioned to catch the northeastern light that came filtering across the North Sea each morning. This was not accidental. Everything about a medieval scriptorium was intentional, measured, and excruciatingly slow. In the year 715 AD, a monk named Eadfrith became Bishop of Lindisfarne, a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria in what is now northeastern England. But before his elevation to bishop, and indeed for several years after, Eadfrith dedicated himself to a single project that would consume nearly a decade of his life, the creation of what we now call the Lindisfarne Gospels. This wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that Eadfrith worked alone. Most gospel books of the period were collaborative efforts, with one monk copying text, another preparing parchment, a third mixing inks, and a fourth, often the most skilled, adding illuminated decorations. Eadfrith did everything himself. He slaughtered the calves whose skin would become vellum, or more likely supervised their slaughter. He soaked the hides in lime for weeks, stretched them on wooden frames, and scraped them with curved blades until the surface became smooth enough to accept ink without bleeding. This process alone, for a book requiring 130 calf skins, would have taken months. The scriptorium at Lindisfarne was approximately 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. It contained 6 writing desks, though rarely were all 6 occupied simultaneously. Monks rotated through various duties: prayer, labor in the fields, copying texts, teaching novices. On any given day, perhaps 3 scribes would be working, and they worked in complete silence. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed life in most medieval monasteries, prescribed silence during work hours. Speaking was permitted only during designated recreation periods or in cases of genuine emergency. Eadfrith's desk sat nearest the window. You can imagine him there on a morning in spring, perhaps in the year 716, beginning his day's work. He would have risen at 2 in the morning for matins, the first prayer service of the day, then returned to his cell for a brief rest before Lauds at dawn. After a breakfast of bread and weak ale, he would climb the stone stairs to the scriptorium, carrying his portable writing desk if he preferred to work standing, or settling onto a wooden bench if his back was troubling him that day. The quill in his hand was a goose feather, one of dozens he would wear down to stubs over the years. Goose feathers were preferred over those of other birds because they were large enough to hold a useful amount of ink, but not so large as to be unwieldy. The feathers came from the left wing because they curved naturally to fit a right-handed writer's grip. Before use, each feather had to be heat-treated, held briefly over hot sand or ashes to harden the shaft and make it less likely to split. Then the tip was cut at a precise angle with a small knife, the penknife, which every scribe kept sharper than a razor. The ink Eadfrith used was iron gall ink, made from oak apples, those strange round growths that appear on oak trees where gall wasps have laid their eggs. These were collected in autumn, dried, and crushed into powder. The powder was mixed with rainwater and ferrous sulfate, derived from green vitriol, a mineral that could be purchased from traveling merchants or extracted from iron deposits. The mixture was left to ferment in a sealed container for weeks, sometimes months, until it achieved the proper consistency and depth of color. Fresh iron gall ink was pale, almost gray, but darkened over days as it oxidized on the parchment. This is why medieval manuscripts sometimes show variations in text color. They were written over many sessions with different batches of ink. For colored inks and pigments used in illuminations, the process was even more complex. Blue came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported from Afghanistan at tremendous expense. It had to be ground into powder so fine that it felt like silk between the fingers. Red came from kermes insects, tiny creatures that lived on Mediterranean oak trees and were dried and crushed to produce a vivid scarlet dye. Gold leaf, used sparingly even in the most elaborate manuscripts, required sheets of actual gold hammered so thin they would flutter on a breath and tear if handled carelessly. These were applied over a sticky base of gum or egg white and burnished with a smooth stone or a dog's tooth until they shone like mirrors. Eadfrith worked with a lightness of touch that seems almost impossible when you examine the Lindisfarne Gospels today, housed in the British Library in London. The manuscript contains 259 leaves, 518 pages, filled with insular majuscule script, a distinctive style of handwriting developed in Irish and British monasteries during the 6th and 7th centuries. Each letter was formed with multiple strokes of the pen, and each stroke had to be precise. A single page of text contained approximately 1,800 letters. At an average rate of production for a skilled scribe, and Eadfrith was exceptionally skilled, he might complete 1 to 2 pages per day under ideal conditions. But conditions were rarely ideal. In winter, the North Sea wind howled through gaps in the stone walls, making the scriptorium bitterly cold. Ink would thicken in its horn, becoming sluggish and difficult to work with. Fingers grew numb, making fine control of the pen nearly impossible. Some monasteries allowed scribes to warm their hands at braziers, but this was risky. A stray spark could destroy months or years of work in minutes. More commonly, monks simply worked through the discomfort or restricted their copying to the warmer months. In summer, different problems arose. The heat could make parchment expand and warp slightly, causing the writing surface to become uneven. Flies, attracted by the organic materials in ink and parchment, would land on wet ink, leaving tiny footprints or becoming stuck and having to be carefully removed with the point of a knife. Sweat from the scribe's hand could stain the parchment or cause the ink to smear. Humidity might prevent ink from drying properly, forcing the scribe to wait hours before continuing work on the same page. The physical toll of this work was considerable. Hours spent hunched over a writing desk, with the manuscript positioned at an awkward angle to catch the light, created chronic back and neck pain. Eye strain was universal among scribes, especially as they aged. The fine detail work required for illuminated letters, some no larger than a fingernail yet containing intricate interlaced patterns and miniature figures, demanded perfect vision and steady hands. Many monks developed arthritis in their fingers and wrists, making their later years of service painful and less productive. Yet Eadfrith persisted. Day after day, year after year, he sat at his desk in the Lindisfarne scriptorium and copied the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in Latin, from earlier manuscript sources that the monastery possessed. He added no original text. His job was pure replication, ensuring that these sacred words would survive in one more copy, protecting them against the loss of earlier versions to fire, water, Viking raids, or simple decay. The decoration he added was anything but simple replication. The Lindisfarne Gospels contain some of the most complex illumination ever produced in medieval Europe. The carpet pages, full-page illustrations of pure abstract geometric and zoomorphic design, contain patterns so intricate that modern scholars using magnifying glasses have identified sections where Eadfrith drew parallel lines thinner than a human hair, maintaining perfect spacing and symmetry without the aid of any mechanical measuring device. Just one of these carpet pages might have required a full month of work, and the manuscript contains 5 of them, along with elaborate decorated initial letters and smaller ornamental elements throughout. But we're getting ahead of the story. In 716, Eadfrith was still in the early stages of his project, still learning the rhythms of his task, still discovering how the materials behaved under his hands, still finding his way into the meditative state that such work required. He didn't yet know that this single book would take him 7 years to complete. He didn't know that his eyesight would begin to fail near the end, forcing him to work in shorter sessions. He didn't know that the manuscript would survive Viking raids, medieval religious upheavals, the Protestant Reformation, and the dissolution of the monasteries, becoming one of the greatest treasures of medieval art. All he knew on that spring morning in 716 was that he had perhaps 257 leaves still to write, illuminate, and perfect, and that the light was good, his ink was fresh, and his hand was steady. He dipped his quill, tapped it gently against the rim of the inkhorn to remove excess liquid, and formed the first letter of the day. How did he maintain his focus, day after day, on a task so repetitive and so slow that modern minds can barely comprehend it? The answer lies partly in theology and partly in the peculiar structure of monastic time. For Eadfrith and his fellow monks, the act of copying scripture was not merely a practical task. It was a form of prayer, an act of devotion as sacred as singing the Psalms or celebrating the Eucharist. Every letter formed was an offering to God, every completed page a small act of worship. This theological framework transformed what might otherwise have been mind-numbing tedium into something approaching transcendence. But theology alone doesn't explain how a human being maintains concentration through thousands of hours of repetitive manual labor. The structure of the monastic day played an equally important role. The rule of Saint Benedict divided each 24-hour period into 8 canonical hours, times of communal prayer that punctuated the day like bells marking the passage of time. Matins at 2 in the morning, lauds at dawn, prime at 6, tertii at 9, sext at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. Each service lasted between 15 minutes and an hour, depending on the season and the feast day. This meant that no work period lasted more than 3 hours without interruption. A scribe would work from after breakfast until tertii, pray for 30 minutes, then return to work until sext. After the midday meal and a brief rest, work resumed until none, followed by more prayer, then perhaps another hour of work before vespers. This rhythm prevented the kind of exhaustion that comes from marathon sessions of focused attention. The human mind can maintain deep concentration for approximately 90 minutes to 2 hours before performance begins to decline. The monastic schedule, though designed for spiritual reasons, inadvertently created optimal conditions for sustained creative work. Between the prayer services, Eadfrith would have worked in what modern psychologists call a state of flow, that condition of complete absorption in a task where time seems to pass differently, where the boundaries between self and work dissolve. The silence of the scriptorium aided this state. Without conversation to interrupt his thoughts, without the constant stimulation of varied activity, Eadfrith could sink deeply into the rhythm of his pen moving across parchment, the slight scratch of quill on vellum, the periodic dip into the inkhorn, the careful formation of each letter. The letters themselves followed strict proportions. In insular majuscule script, the body height of most letters was consistent, with ascenders and descenders, the parts of letters like B and P that extend above or below the main body, carefully controlled. Scribes learned these proportions through years of practice, beginning as young novices by copying single letters repeatedly on wax tablets that could be smoothed and reused. Only after mastering individual letters would they progress to words, then sentences, then full texts. By the time a monk was entrusted with copying an important manuscript like a gospel book, he had written millions of letters, and his hand had developed muscle memory so precise that he could maintain consistent letter size and spacing almost unconsciously. Yet Eadfrith still made mistakes. We know this because some are visible in the surviving manuscript. Here and there a letter has been scraped away with a knife and rewritten, a word has been corrected in the margin, a line has been crossed out. These errors were inevitable over such a long project, and they tell us something important about the medieval attitude toward perfectionism. While scribes aimed for accuracy, they also understood that human imperfection was inescapable. Some manuscripts even contain small notes from scribes apologizing to future readers for errors or complaining about their working conditions. "The parchment is hairy," one scribe wrote in the margin of a 9th century text. "It is dark," wrote another. "This is difficult work." The vellum itself varied in quality from sheet to sheet. Although Eadfrith prepared all his parchment following the same process, no two animal skins are identical. Some were thicker, some thinner. Some had subtle patterns where blood vessels had run close to the surface. Some retained faint traces of the animal's original coloring. Medieval scribes developed a keen eye for these variations and would often select particular sheets for particular purposes. The smoothest, whitest vellum was reserved for the most important pages, the opening of each gospel, the carpet pages, the sections with the most elaborate decoration. Lesser quality sheets were used for less prominent sections of text. The preparation of a single skin of vellum was labor-intensive enough to make you understand why parchment was reused so frequently in the medieval period. The hide, once removed from the calf, was soaked in a lime solution for up to 2 weeks. This loosened the hair on one side and any remaining flesh on the other. The skin was then stretched tight on a wooden frame and scraped with a curved blade called a lunellum, named for its crescent moon shape. The scraping had to be done carefully, removing hair and flesh without cutting through the hide. Too much pressure and the skin would tear. Too little and hair follicles would remain, creating rough spots that would catch the pen and cause ink to bleed. After the initial scraping, the skin was left to dry under tension on the frame, then scraped again, this time with a finer blade to create an even surface. Pumice stone was used to smooth any remaining irregularities. The result was a sheet of material that was creamy white, slightly translucent, and had a subtle nap, a directional texture created by the grain of the original skin. Scribes learned to write in the direction of this nap, as the pen would flow more smoothly. For the Lindisfarne Gospels, Eadfrith would have needed approximately 130 calf skins. The monastery kept herds for this purpose, but even so, accumulating enough high-quality vellum for a major project would have taken time. It's possible that Eadfrith spent a full year or more just preparing his materials before he wrote a single word of text. This preparatory phase was part of the meditation, part of the devotion. Rushing was antithetical to the entire enterprise. The quills wore out quickly. A single goose feather might last for a few days of heavy use before the tip became too blunt or split to write properly. This meant constant resharpening, trimming the nib to maintain its shape. Most scribes developed calluses on their fingertips from the pressure of holding the pen and on their cutting hand from the repeated use of the penknife. These calluses became badges of identity. You could identify a scribe by his hands. The posture required for writing was uncomfortable by modern standards. Scribes typically sat on backless benches or stools, sometimes with a footrest. The manuscript itself rested on a slanted writing desk or on the scribe's lap, supported by a board. This brought the work close to the face, necessary for seeing fine detail, but hard on the neck and shoulders. Some evidence suggests that older scribes, or those with back problems, wrote standing up, with the desk raised to chest height. This allowed for better posture but made the work more physically tiring. In the summer months, the long days of northern Britain meant that natural light was available for extended periods, but for much of the year daylight was scarce. Winter days at Lindisfarne's latitude, about 55 degrees north, gave only 7 or 8 hours of useful daylight. Cloud cover, frequent in coastal Northumbria, further reduced available light. This meant that for several months of the year, scribes could work only during a narrow window of time when the light was adequate. Artificial lighting was available but problematic. Candles made from animal tallow produced smoke that could damage both the scribe's lungs and the manuscript itself. Soot would settle on parchment, creating dark spots that had to be carefully cleaned. Oil lamps were cleaner but expensive. Some monasteries restricted evening work in the scriptorium to conserve resources and protect manuscripts. Others allowed it but required scribes to work in pairs, one to hold the light, one to write. This partnership created its own challenges, as the person holding the lamp had to remain perfectly still to avoid creating moving shadows that would make fine work impossible. Despite these obstacles, Eadfrith progressed. The Gospel of Matthew took shape, first 27 chapters, 1,071 verses in the Latin Vulgate translation. Then Mark, the shortest Gospel at 16 chapters and 678 verses. The work developed its own momentum. Months turned into years. Eadfrith moved from being a relatively young monk to middle age, his beard graying, his eyesight beginning to require him to hold the manuscript slightly farther from his face. His hand remained steady, but he worked more slowly than he had at the beginning, taking more frequent breaks to rest his eyes and stretch his cramped fingers. The community around him continued its rhythms. Other monks came and went from the scriptorium, working on their own copying projects, lectionaries, psalters, saints' lives, administrative records. Novices arrived at the monastery, wide-eyed and uncertain, and gradually settled into the routines of monastic life. Some would eventually join Eadfrith at the scribal desks, others would find their vocations in the gardens, the kitchen, the infirmary, or the church. Abbots died and were replaced. Seasons cycled through their endless repetitions, the harsh winters when ice formed inside the water jugs in the scribes' cells, the wet springs when damp seemed to penetrate everything, the brief glorious summers when the sun barely set and wildflowers colored the coastal meadows, the golden autumns when the monastery prepared for winter's privations. Through it all, Eadfrith copied, and as he copied, he illuminated. The decorated pages grew more elaborate as he gained confidence, as his skill deepened through sheer repetition. The interlaced patterns became more complex, the color combinations more sophisticated. By the time he reached the Gospel of John, the last Gospel, the one he saved for the end, he was working at the height of his abilities, creating pages that would be studied and marveled at for more than a millennium. But there was something else developing too, something harder to quantify. The long, slow years of devotion to a single task had changed Eadfrith in ways that extended beyond craftsmanship. What was happening inside his mind as the decades passed, year after year at the same desk, forming the same sacred words? The question of what happens to a human consciousness during years of repetitive devotional labor is one that modern psychology has only recently begun to explore with any rigor. But we can make informed speculations based on Eadfrith's work itself, which bears the marks of a mind transformed by its own discipline. Consider the carpet pages, those full-page geometric designs that appear at the beginning of each gospel. They contain no text, no representational images, only pattern. Interlaced bands weave over and under each other in configurations so complex that following a single strand from beginning to end can take several minutes of careful attention. Within these interlaces, Eadfrith inserted zoomorphic elements, stylized birds, dogs, serpents, their bodies elongated and twisted to fit the geometric structure. The level of planning required to execute such designs is extraordinary. There are no preliminary sketches visible beneath the finished work, no obvious mistakes corrected. Either Eadfrith worked from patterns that have since been lost, or he held these incredibly complex designs entirely in his mind. Both explanations suggest something remarkable about his mental state. If he worked from patterns, he had to translate them faithfully onto vellum while making countless small adjustments to fit the specific dimensions of each page and to accommodate the variations in the parchment surface. If he worked from mental visualization, he was exercising a capacity for sustained internal imagery that most modern people would find impossible to maintain. Either way, the work required a kind of meditation, a state of consciousness where distracting thoughts fell away and only the immediate task remained. Neuroscientists studying long-term meditation practitioners have found measurable changes in brain structure, particularly in regions associated with attention, interoception, and emotional regulation. The monks and nuns who participate in these studies typically have decades of daily meditation practice behind them. Eadfrith's years at the writing desk, in the silence of the scriptorium, engaged in work that demanded absolute focus, likely produced similar neural adaptations. His brain physically changed in response to the demands he placed on it. But there was more than neurology at work. There was also meaning. Every letter Eadfrith formed carried theological weight. The Gospels were not merely historical texts to be copied, they were the foundation of his faith, the words through which God had revealed himself to humanity. When Eadfrith wrote "In principio erat verbum," in the beginning was the word, the opening of John's Gospel, he was not just copying Latin phrases. He was meditating on the mystery of divine incarnation, on the idea that God had entered human history as a speaking, teaching presence. This sense of participation in something larger than himself sustained Eadfrith through the difficulties inherent in his task. When his back ached from hours of sitting, when his eyes burned from squinting at fine detail, when winter cold made his fingers stiff and clumsy, he had a framework that made the suffering meaningful. This was not merely endurance it was offering. The discomfort itself became part of the gift he was making to God. We know that Eadfrith completed his great work sometime around 721 AD. The evidence comes from a colophon, a note added to the manuscript in the 10th century by a priest named Aldred, who also added an Anglo-Saxon translation between the lines of Eadfrith's Latin text. Aldred's note tells us that Eadfrith made the book for God and Saint Cuthbert, the famous bishop of Lindisfarne, whose remains were kept as relics at the monastery. The manuscript was apparently intended to honor Cuthbert's memory and to serve as a ceremonial gospel book for use during important liturgies. After Eadfrith finished the copying and illumination, the manuscript still required binding. According to Aldred's colophon, this was done by Ethelwald, who became Bishop of Lindisfarne after Eadfrith's death. The binding would have involved sewing the folded sheets, called quills, together with linen thread, then attaching them to wooden boards covered with leather. The original binding has not survived, but it was likely elaborate, possibly decorated with metalwork and precious stones. The exterior would have reflected the treasured status of the interior. From 721 until 793, the Lindisfarne Gospels remained at the monastery, used during major feasts and special occasions. Monks and visiting clergy would have marveled at its beauty, but they would also have understood it as a functional object. Books in this period were not museum pieces to be preserved behind glass, they were tools for worship, meant to be opened, read from, handled with reverence but not excessive fear of damage. Then came the Vikings. In 793, Scandinavian raiders attacked Lindisfarne, destroying much of the monastery and killing many monks. This raid, one of the first recorded Viking attacks on Britain, sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with horror. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, with plunder and slaughter. The survivors fled, taking with them the most precious portable objects they could carry, including the Lindisfarne Gospels and the bones of Saint Cuthbert. For more than a century, the manuscript traveled with the community of Cuthbert's followers as they sought safe refuge from continuing Viking threats. Legend holds that at one point the book was lost overboard during a sea crossing and miraculously recovered undamaged. But this story may be pious fiction. What we know for certain is that the manuscript survived, which itself is remarkable. Vellum is durable, but it's not indestructible. Water will cause it to swell and warp, fire will reduce it to ash in seconds. Rough handling can tear pages. The fact that a book this old and this heavily used still exists, with relatively minor damage, speaks to the care with which it was guarded through centuries of upheaval. Eventually the community settled at Durham, where a great cathedral was built to house Cuthbert's shrine. The Lindisfarne Gospels became part of the cathedral's treasury. It remained there through the Middle Ages, surviving the religious turbulence of the Reformation more or less intact. In 1539, when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the manuscript was seized along with other valuable objects. It passed through various hands, eventually entering the collection of Sir Robert Cotton, a 17th-century antiquarian whose library formed the core of what would become the British Library. Today, the Lindisfarne Gospels rest in a climate-controlled case in London, open to a different page every few months to distribute the exposure to light and minimize deterioration. Visitors can view it, though not touch it. High-resolution digital scans are available online, allowing scholars and curious readers worldwide to examine every detail of Eadfrith's work. These scans reveal things invisible to earlier generations of researchers: the order in which different colors were applied, the variations in pressure as Eadfrith's hand moved across the page, even individual pen strokes. What they cannot reveal is the experience of creating the manuscript. They cannot show us what it felt like to be Eadfrith, day after day, year after year, slowly transforming piles of raw materials, animal skins, crushed minerals, oak galls, gold leaf, into something that transcended its components. The digital image preserves the result but not the process, the product but not the labor. And yet, perhaps something of Eadfrith's consciousness does survive in the manuscript itself. There is a quality to the Lindisfarne Gospels that goes beyond technical skill, beyond artistic achievement. It has a presence, a sense of intentionality that comes through even in photographs. You can feel, looking at those pages, that they were made by someone fully absorbed in their making, someone for whom the work was not separate from prayer, not separate from life. In our age of rapid production and instant gratification, there is something almost incomprehensible about dedicating 7 years to a single book. We struggle to imagine maintaining focus on one project for that long, especially a project so repetitive, so demanding of precision, so physically uncomfortable. Modern book production involves dozens or hundreds of people working in parallel, using machines that can print, bind, and package thousands of volumes in a day. The idea of one person, working largely alone, taking 7 years to produce one copy of one text, seems absurd, inefficient, almost perverse. But efficiency was not Eadfrith's goal. Production volume was not his metric of success. He was engaged in an act of devotion that was simultaneously craft, art, prayer, and meditation. The slowness was not a bug but a feature. It allowed for the kind of attention that makes something truly extraordinary. Every letter received his full consciousness. Every decorative element was executed with complete care. Nothing was hurried, nothing skimped, nothing done carelessly because deadlines loomed or attention flagged. In this, perhaps Eadfrith has something to teach our frantic, distracted age. Not that we should all become monks or spend years copying manuscripts. Most of us lack both the vocation and the circumstances that would make such a life possible or desirable. But perhaps we might learn something about the value of sustained attention, of doing one thing fully rather than many things partially, of allowing work to unfold at its own necessary pace rather than forcing it into artificial schedules dictated by external demands. The Lindisfarne Gospels exist because one person was willing to spend 7 years of his finite life making them. He aged visibly during those years, his hand growing less steady, his eyes less sharp, his back more curved. He sacrificed alternative possibilities, other books he might have copied, other contributions he might have made to his community. And at the end, he had created one of the supreme achievements of medieval art, an object that has now outlived him by 13 centuries and will likely outlive our entire civilization. Not every act of slow, careful work produces a masterpiece. Most don't. But every act of sustained attention, of refusing to rush, of giving full consciousness to the task at hand, has value beyond its immediate product. It changes the person doing it. It creates a different relationship between worker and work, between time and meaning. It offers, in a world obsessed with speed and scale, a quiet testimony to the power of patience. Eadfrith died sometime in the 720s, not long after completing his gospel book. We don't know the circumstances of his death or where he was buried. His grave, if it was ever marked, has long since been lost. But his work remains, and in it, something of him remains too. Not his face or his voice, but his attention, his devotion, his willingness to give years of his life to something that required them. That seems, in the end, like a fair bargain. Most of us will be forgotten much more quickly and leave behind much less.
The pain began in his left thumb, a small stiffness that Brother Elfric first noticed on a cold November morning in the year 1063. He was 42 years old, which was not young, but not yet old by the standards of his time.
and he had been copying manuscripts for 26 years, more than half his life. The stiffness came and went for several weeks, sometimes barely noticeable, other times sharp enough to make him wince when he gripped his pen. By Christmas, it had spread to his index and middle fingers, and by the feast of the Epiphany in January, his entire left hand ached constantly. Ælfric lived at the Abbey of Ramsey, a Benedictine monastery in the fenlands of eastern England, about 70 miles north of London. The abbey had been founded in 969 AD by Oswald, Bishop of Worcester, on an island. The name Ramsey means wild garlic island, surrounded by marshes and waterways. It was prosperous by the standards of the time, with extensive landholdings and a reputation for learning. The library contained perhaps 200 volumes, an impressive collection for an 11th century English monastery, and the scriptorium employed between 4 and 6 copyists at any given time, depending on the season and the health of the community. The fenlands were beautiful in their desolate way, flat horizons broken only by church towers and the occasional stand of willows, water glinting silver under vast skies, enormous flocks of waterfowl wheeling and calling over the marshes. But they were also cold and damp, especially in winter. The moisture seemed to penetrate everything: walls, clothing, bedding, and certainly the joints of men who spent their days sitting still in unheated rooms. Arthritis was common among the monks, particularly those who performed manual labor or maintained fixed postures for long periods. Scribes were especially vulnerable. At first, Ælfric tried to ignore the pain. He was working on a copy of Augustine's City of God, a massive theological treatise that would ultimately require 3 large volumes to complete. He had been commissioned to make the copy by the abbot himself, who intended it as a gift to the Bishop of Lincoln. It was an honor to receive such a commission, and Ælfric had no desire to admit weakness or ask to be relieved of the task. So he continued working, adjusting his grip on the pen to minimize the discomfort, taking more frequent breaks to flex his fingers, warming his hands over a brazier before beginning each session. But the pain worsened. By spring, both hands were affected, and the joints of his fingers had begun to swell visibly. The swelling made it difficult to maintain the precise control required for good script. His letters, which had always been crisp and even, began to show inconsistencies, slight wavering in the downstrokes, occasional smudges where his cramped hand pressed too hard on still wet ink. He started making more mistakes, transposing letters or skipping words, errors he would normally never commit. Each mistake required correction, which meant scraping away the incorrect text with a knife, an operation that itself required a steady hand and caused additional pain. The other scribes noticed, though they said nothing directly. In a community bound by silence during work hours, communication happened through glances, small gestures, the subtle adjustments of behavior that conveyed sympathy or concern without words. Brother Martin, the oldest scribe in the scriptorium, began arriving early to light the brazier and warm the room before the others appeared. Brother Wilfrid, who worked at the desk next to Ælfric's, started preparing extra quills each morning, cutting and shaping them so that Ælfric would have fresh pens ready without having to perform that task himself. These small kindnesses were never acknowledged openly, but Ælfric understood them and was grateful. The abbot too noticed the change in Ælfric's work. Abbots of major monasteries had many responsibilities, managing extensive properties, negotiating with secular authorities, overseeing the spiritual welfare of dozens of monks, maintaining discipline, ensuring adequate food and supplies. But a good abbot also paid attention to the individuals under his care, watching for signs of illness, distress, or spiritual struggle. Abbot Wulfric had governed Ramsey for 15 years and knew his monks well. He saw that Ælfric was in pain, and he saw too that Ælfric would work himself to exhaustion rather than ask for relief. In the spring of 1064, Abbot Wulfric called Ælfric to his chambers for a private conversation. This was unusual enough to make Ælfric nervous. Private audiences with the abbot typically occurred only when serious matters needed discussion, and Ælfric could not think of any rule he had broken or duty he had neglected. He knocked on the heavy oak door with his right hand, keeping his swollen left hand partially hidden in the sleeve of his habit.
"Come," the abbot's voice called from within.
The abbot's chamber was modest by the standards of secular lords but comfortable by monastic standards. A fire burned in the hearth, a luxury in an institution where most rooms remained unheated. A writing desk stood near the window, covered with documents awaiting the abbot's attention. A crucifix hung on the wall, and beneath it a prie-dieu for private prayer. The abbot himself, a man in his 60s with a lined face and thoughtful eyes, gestured for Ælfric to sit on a wooden stool near the fire. "Your hands pain you," the abbot said. It was not a question. Ælfric hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Father, but I can still work. The pain is manageable. Let me see them." Reluctantly, Ælfric extended both hands. In the firelight, the swelling was obvious, the joints of several fingers visibly enlarged and slightly reddened. The abbot took Ælfric's hands gently in his own, feeling the warmth of inflammation, noting how Ælfric flinched when certain joints were touched. "How long has this been troubling you?" "Since November, Father." "It began small, but it has grown worse." The abbot nodded slowly, still holding Ælfric's hands. "I have seen this before. Brother Simon, who died before you arrived here, suffered similarly. His hands became so twisted that in his final years he could no longer write at all. He spent his last decade in prayer and in teaching novices to sing. He was content with that service, but I know he mourned the loss of his scribal work." Ælfric said nothing. The prospect of losing the ability to write was almost unbearable to contemplate. Copying manuscripts was not just his occupation, it was his vocation, his contribution to the community, his form of prayer. Without it, who would he be? "I am not removing you from the scriptorium," the abbot continued, reading Ælfric's thoughts in his expression, "but I am changing your assignments. The city of God is too demanding a project for hands that hurt as yours do. I am giving it to Brother Martin to complete. You will work instead on shorter texts, pieces that allow for more frequent rest, that do not require you to maintain position for such extended periods." Relief and disappointment warred in Ælfric's chest. Relief that he would not have to admit defeat, that he could continue working. Disappointment that his most prestigious commission was being taken from him, given to another. But he knew the abbot was right. Better to accept limitations now than to push until his hands failed completely. "Yes, Father. Thank you. There is something else." The abbot released Ælfric's hands and moved to a small chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and withdrew a linen bag. "Sister Edith, at the convent of St. Mary's in Chatteris, prepares herbal remedies. She has studied the works of Hildegard of Bingen and knows much about treating ailments of the joints. I have asked her to prepare this salve for you. Apply it morning and evening, rubbing it gently into the affected areas. It will not cure you, I must be honest about that, but it may ease the inflammation and slow the progression of the disease." Ælfric took the bag with trembling hands. The kindness was almost overwhelming. Abbots were busy men with countless demands on their attention and resources. That Abbot Wulfric had noticed his suffering, sought out a remedy, taken time for this conversation, it spoke to a quality of leadership that went beyond mere administrative competence. "I don't know what to say, Father. Say nothing. Use the salve. Rest your hands when they need rest. And trust that God still has work for you, even if it is not the work you expected." That night, in his cell, Ælfric opened the linen bag and found a small pottery jar sealed with wax. He broke the seal and sniffed the contents, a sharp, resinous scent with underlying notes of something floral. He rubbed a small amount onto his swollen knuckles, wincing at the initial sting, then feeling a gradual warmth spread through the joint. Whether it was the herbs themselves or simply the act of massage and attention, the pain did seem to ease slightly. He lay on his narrow bed in the darkness, listening to the wind rustle the reeds in the marshes beyond the monastery walls, and thought about the future. 26 years of copying manuscripts, how many more years would his hands allow him? 10? 5? 1? And what would he do when he could no longer hold a pen? These were not idle questions. In monastic life, identity was closely tied to function. You were what you did. A cantor if you led the singing, a cellarer if you managed food stores, a scribe if you copied books.
Men who could no longer perform their primary duties often struggled to find purpose, even in communities that theoretically valued all forms of service equally. Ælfric had known several monks who, after injury or illness forced them to give up their work, seemed to fade away, dying not from any specific disease but from a kind of spiritual deflation. He did not want to become one of those men, but he also didn't know how to prevent it. His entire adult life had been shaped around the scriptorium, around the rhythm of pen on parchment, around the satisfaction of completing a page, a quire, a full manuscript. Who was Brother Ælfric without that? The question hung in the darkness, unanswered. Outside, a night bird called some marsh creature hunting in the reeds. Ælfric pulled his thin blanket closer against the chill and eventually slept, his hands still aching despite the salve, his mind circling uncertainly around an unknowable future. In the morning, he would return to the scriptorium. The abbot had given him a new assignment. A copy of the Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational text that governed monastic life. It was a work Ælfric knew almost by heart, having lived by its principles for more than 2 decades. Perhaps, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, that familiarity would make the copying easier, would allow his wounded hands to work from deep memory rather than requiring constant vigilant attention. Perhaps, or perhaps each day forward would be a struggle, a negotiation between will and limitation, between what he wanted to do and what his body would allow. Only time would reveal which. And for a scribe accustomed to measuring time in manuscripts completed, that uncertainty was its own form of suffering. The Rule of Saint Benedict was a slender text compared to Augustine's sprawling City of God, only 73 short chapters outlining the principles of monastic life. In the original Latin, it ran to perhaps 30,000 words, which meant Ælfric could complete a serviceable copy in 3 or 4 months if he worked steadily. But the abbot had specified that this was not to be a rushed production. The manuscript was intended for the monastery's own library, to replace an older copy whose pages had become fragile with age and constant use. It deserved care, and Ælfric was to work at whatever pace his hands allowed. This permission to slow down changed something fundamental in Ælfric's relationship with his work. For 26 years he had measured his productivity by pages completed per day, had felt a subtle pressure to maintain output comparable to the other scribes. The scriptorium was not overtly competitive, monastic life discouraged pride and comparison, but human nature found ways to express itself even under vows of humility. Scribes knew who completed manuscripts quickly and who labored slowly. They noticed whose work required frequent correction and whose flowed clean and even. These observations were rarely spoken aloud, but they informed the assignments given by the abbot, the respect accorded by fellow monks, the internal sense of one's own worth. Now, freed from the expectation of speed, Ælfric discovered a different way of working. He began each morning by applying Sister Edith's salve, massaging it slowly into each finger joint, taking time to feel where the inflammation was worst, where the bones had begun to deform slightly. Then he would perform gentle exercises, opening and closing his hands, rotating his wrists, stretching his fingers, movements that seemed to help maintain mobility even if they did nothing for the underlying disease. Only after this preparation did he enter the scriptorium. He would arrange his materials with deliberate care, the parchment positioned at precisely the right angle to catch the light, the inkhorn placed where he could reach it without stretching, the quills selected and tested, the knife for corrections within easy reach. Then he would sit, or sometimes stand, when sitting became too uncomfortable, and begin. The first sentence of the rule read, Ausculta, o fili, praectepta magistri, listen, my son, to the precepts of the master. Ælfric formed each letter slowly, feeling the movement in his hand, adjusting pressure and angle to minimize pain. The work became meditative in a way it had never been before. Previously his hand had moved almost automatically, his mind partly elsewhere, on the meaning of the text, on the next meal, on a conversation from the previous day. Now, every letter required conscious attention. He had to notice exactly how he gripped the quill, how much force he applied, which movements caused sharp pain, and which only dull aching. This forced presence brought him deeper into the text itself. Listen, my son, to the precepts of the master, and incline the ear of your heart. The rule was speaking to him differently now, as someone whose body was failing, whose future was uncertain. Benedict had written for monks who would age, sicken, die. The rule contained provisions for the elderly and infirm, instructions on caring for those who could no longer perform the full range of monastic duties. Ælfric had copied those passages before without really thinking about them. Now they resonated with personal urgency. Chapter 36 of the rule dealt specifically with the care of the sick. Before all things and above all things care must be taken of the sick, so that they will be served in very deed as Christ himself. Ælfric had always admired this passage theoretically, recognizing Benedict's wisdom in placing care for the vulnerable at the center of communal life. But now he understood it from the other side, as someone who needed care, who was becoming one of those brothers for whom special provisions must be made. The understanding brought humility, but also gratitude. Abbot Wulfric had already implemented Benedict's instruction by obtaining the salve, by adjusting Ælfric's assignments, by making clear that Ælfric remained valued even with diminished capacity. Brother Martin and Brother Wilfrid continued their small kindnesses. Martin still arrived early to warm the scriptorium, Wilfrid still prepared extra quills. These actions, which might seem trivial to an outsider, made the difference between bearable work and unbearable struggle. By summer, Ælfric had completed the first half of the rule. His progress was slower than it would have been in his healthy years, but the quality of the work was, if anything, superior. The forced attention to each letter had eliminated the small inconsistencies that inevitably crept in when a scribe worked too quickly. His script was beautifully even, the spacing between letters and words perfectly judged, the ink application consistent. The abbot, reviewing the completed quires, remarked that it was some of the finest work Ælfric had ever produced. But the pain was worsening. By autumn, Ælfric's morning preparation routine had expanded to nearly an hour longer application of the salve, more extensive exercises, sometimes soaking his hands in warm water to loosen the stiff joints. Even with all these measures, he could work for only 2 or 3 hours before the pain became too intense to continue. Some days, he managed only a single page. Other days, when the weather was particularly cold or damp, he could barely hold the pen at all. On those worst days, Ælfric would sit at his desk with his hands folded in his lap, simply looking at the manuscript before him. He would read what he had written, checking for errors but also just absorbing the text, letting Benedict's words sink deeper into his consciousness. The workshop where we are to toil faithfully at all these tasks is the enclosure of the monastery and stability in the community. The scriptorium was his workshop, the place where he labored at his particular task. But what happened when the tools failed? When the hands could no longer perform the work? The question led him to consider other forms of labor, other ways of contributing. He began spending time in the library, organizing volumes, checking them for damage that needed repair. His knowledge of manuscripts was extensive. He could identify different styles of script, estimate the age of a binding, recognize the signs of insect damage or water staining. This knowledge was valuable, and Brother Thomas, the librarian, welcomed Ælfric's assistance. He also began teaching. Several young monks had recently arrived at Ramsey, novices who needed instruction in reading and writing Latin. Ælfric discovered that he enjoyed this work. Explaining the principles of good script, demonstrating proper posture and pen grip, helping a struggling student understand why certain letter combinations were difficult, these activities used his expertise without requiring hours of continuous manual labor. His hands could rest while his mind remained active. Yet he mourned the loss of his primary identity. Teaching was valuable, library work was important, but they were not the same as creating manuscripts. There was a particular satisfaction in completing a full copy of a text, in knowing that because of your labor, one more copy of an important work existed in the world. Libraries burned, manuscripts were lost to water damage or theft or simple neglect. Every copy made was a hedge against oblivion, a small victory for preservation over entropy. Ælfric had spent 26 years contributing to that victory. Now his contribution was diminishing. Winter arrived, and with it, the worst pain Ælfric had yet experienced. On the coldest days his fingers curled involuntarily, the joints so swollen and stiff that he could not straighten them completely. The deformity was becoming permanent. He could still write, but only with great effort and for very short periods. The Rule of Saint Benedict, which he had hoped to complete by Christmas, remained unfinished as January arrived, then February. Abbot Wulfric, observing Ælfric's struggle, made another adjustment. He assigned brother Wilfrid to work as Ælfric's assistant. Wilfrid was a capable scribe, though not as experienced as Ælfric. Under this new arrangement, Ælfric would dictate and supervise while Wilfrid did the actual copying. Ælfric could still contribute his knowledge, his eye for detail, his understanding of proper script, but without the physical demands that had become so difficult. The arrangement worked, after an initial period of adjustment. Ælfric had to learn to express verbally what had always been intuitive physical knowledge. The descender on that P needs to be slightly longer. Watch your spacing, you're crowding the letters in the middle of the line. The ink is too thin, add a bit more gall powder. Wilfrid, for his part, had to learn to accept correction without defensiveness, to understand that Ælfric's criticisms came from experience and were meant to improve the work, not to wound pride. Together, they completed the rule by Easter of 1065. The manuscript was beautiful. Wilfrid's youthful hand was steadier than Ælfric's had been, and under Ælfric's guidance he had achieved a consistency and elegance that he had not previously managed on his own. At the ceremony where the completed manuscript was presented to the abbot and placed in the library, both scribes were acknowledged, and the abbot made special mention of how their collaboration had produced something neither could have achieved alone. Ælfric felt pride in the accomplishment, but also a deep sadness. This was the 11th manuscript he had completed, or helped to complete, during his time at Ramsey. In his healthy years, 11 manuscripts in 26 years would have seemed like modest productivity. Many scribes completed more, but given his circumstances, given the increasing disability of his hands, 11 seemed like a respectable number. Would there be a 12th? Would his hands allow even one more project? The question was answered within weeks. The abbot called Ælfric to his chambers again and presented him with a new commission, a psalter, a book containing the 150 psalms used in daily monastic worship. It would be a collaborative project from the start, with Wilfrid doing the majority of the copying under Ælfric's supervision. But there was a special element to this commission. The abbot wanted Ælfric himself to copy the opening of Psalm 1, Beatus vio qui non habet, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, in his own hand, as a declaration of his continuing membership in the community of scribes, despite his disability. It was a generous gesture, recognizing both Ælfric's limitations and his enduring value. He accepted the commission with gratitude, knowing it might well be his last opportunity to form letters on parchment, to participate directly in the physical act of copying that had defined his adult life. The work on the psalter began in May and continued through the summer and autumn. Wilfrid copied steadily under Ælfric's watchful eye, while Ælfric prepared himself for the single page he would contribute. He practiced, using wax tablets that could be erased and reused, forming the letters of Psalm 1 over and over until he was confident he could execute them properly on the precious vellum. He timed his work for a mild day in September, when his hands were as flexible as they ever were anymore, when the light was good and his mind was calm. The page took him 6 hours to complete, with frequent breaks to rest his cramping fingers. But when it was finished, it was beautiful. Not perfect by the standards of his younger self, perhaps, but imbued with something that perfection alone could never convey. You could see, if you looked closely, the slight wavering in some of the strokes, the places where pain had made the pen tremble slightly. But you could also see the care, the devotion, the refusal to surrender completely to limitation. Every letter bore witness to the cost of its making and the determination behind that making. When the psalter was complete, in December of 1065, it became Ælfric's 12th and final manuscript. His hands, by then, had deteriorated to the point where even with maximum determination he could no longer control a pen adequately. The joints were severely deformed, several fingers permanently bent. The pain was constant, though he had learned to manage it better, through the salve, through heat, through carefully gauged movement, through acceptance. What would the remaining years bring, and how would he find meaning in them without the work that had sustained him? The year 1066 arrived with its momentous events, the death of King Edward the Confessor, the contested succession, the invasion of William of Normandy, the Battle of Hastings, the conquest that would reshape English society. But at Ramsey Abbey, isolated in the fenlands, these dramatic political changes initially seemed distant, almost abstract. Life continued in its established rhythms: prayer, work, meals, sleep, the seasonal cycle of agricultural labor and liturgical celebration. For Elfric, now 45 years old with hands that resembled gnarled tree roots more than human appendages, the Norman conquest mattered less than the daily challenge of finding purpose in a body that increasingly refused to cooperate. He could no longer write. That fact, which he had dreaded for years, had finally arrived as an unchangeable reality. His identity as a scribe, carefully constructed over 26 years, had been forcibly dissolved. He might have despaired. Some men in his position did, but Elfric discovered resources within himself that he had not known existed, or perhaps that had been developed, unrecognized, through all those years of patient labor at the scriptorium desk. He had learned perseverance through copying, had internalized the lesson that meaningful work proceeds slowly, that value accumulates through sustained attention over time. These lessons now served him in a different context. His teaching role expanded. More novices arrived at Ramsey in the aftermath of the conquest, young men seeking stability in a world suddenly uncertain, choosing religious life partly from vocation and partly from practical need for security. Elfric became their primary instructor in letters. He could no longer demonstrate proper penmanship through his own writing, but he understood the principles thoroughly and could explain them clearly. He would sit beside a student, watching the young man's hand move across the wax tablet or parchment, offering corrections. "Your posture is creating tension in your shoulder that travels down to your hand. Sit straighter. You're gripping too tightly. The pen should rest lightly between your fingers, controlled but not strangled." He taught them other things too, lessons drawn from his decades in the scriptorium. He taught them about patience, about accepting that significant work takes time, about finding satisfaction in the process rather than only in completion. He taught them about attention, how to notice what their hands were doing, how to stay present to the task rather than letting their minds wander. He taught them, though not in these words, forms of mindfulness that would not be systematically articulated in Western thought for many centuries. The students valued his instruction. Brother Elfric, unable to demonstrate but able to explain, became known as an excellent teacher. Young scribes trained under his supervision developed good technique and, more importantly, the right attitudes toward their work. They learned that copying manuscripts was not mere mechanical.
For those who survived, preservation became a battle against time itself. Monks learned to repair vellum tears with fine thread, to strengthen bindings with pigskin. Some experimented with wax coatings to repel moisture. Others, faced with mold and insects, fumigated libraries with herbs or even sulfur smoke. The care they took was meticulous, obsessive, nearly parental. And yet, even with all their labor, the monks could not prevent decay. Ink-faded pages crumbled. The silence that had preserved the word began to yield to the noise of modernity. By the late 1400s, the printing press appeared, first in Mainz, then everywhere. Johannes Gutenberg's Bible, produced around 455, was both a triumph and an ending. It reproduced in months what once took lifetimes. The world turned a page, and the scribes were left behind. Many of them lived to see their craft die. There are records of monks in the mid-15th century writing laments in the margins of manuscripts. "Printing has taken our work from us." Another wrote, "Here ends the work of the pen, begun by love and ended by iron." The tone is not anger, but melancholy, a quiet acknowledgement that time had moved on. Yet, paradoxically, printing did not erase their legacy, it immortalized it. Gutenberg's typeface was modeled after the black-letter scripts of late medieval scribes. Even the layout of printed pages, the margins, initials, spacing, was borrowed from monastic manuscripts. The machine could copy faster, but it copied the style of those who worked in silence. Today, when scholars study these ancient manuscripts, they find fingerprints pressed faintly into the margins, literal traces of the monks' hands.
Some pages bear smudges where a scribe leaned too heavily, or where a drop of candle wax fell centuries ago. Through these accidents, their humanity endures. Every stain, every correction, every faint sigh etched into the parchment is a testament to the persistence of effort, of boredom transformed into legacy. In this way, the monks who copied books so slowly that they aged decades became something beyond writers. They were custodians of time. Their slowness was not inefficiency, it was continuity. They stretched the thread of human thought across centuries so that others could walk it into the future. And perhaps that is the most astonishing part, not the words they wrote, but the faith they placed in their permanence. Each quill stroke was a gesture of belief. That knowledge, though fragile, was worth preserving, even when the world did not seem to need it. As their manuscripts spread, some vanished, others endured. Those who survived became the backbone of modern libraries. Yet when we open them now, centuries later, the ink still whispers. It tells of a world where silence was a form of speech, and patience was power. And you might wonder, when the monks laid down their quills, did they believe that anyone, 1,000 years later, would still be reading what they had written by candlelight? By the end of the 15th century, Europe was a continent waking from a long sleep. The old rhythms of the monastery, the bells, the prayers, the scratch of quills still lingered, but the outside world had grown louder. Printing presses clattered in cities like Mainz, Nuremberg, and Venice, spewing words faster than any human hand could trace them. It was as if the silence of centuries had suddenly found a voice. For the monks it must have been disorienting. Imagine a scribe at St. Gall or Monte Cassino, bending over his work as he always had, hearing the faint rumor of a new machine that could do his job in days. At first it would have sounded like a curiosity, a passing novelty. After all, books were sacred things. Could mere metal type, stamped and inked by laymen, carry the word of God? Surely not. Surely divine truth required human hands. But the presses multiplied. Gutenberg's invention spread faster than belief itself. Within 50 years, printing houses flourished in nearly every major city. The price of books plummeted. What had once been the treasure of monasteries became accessible to merchants, scholars, even wealthy artisans. A copy of the Bible that once took a year to make could now be printed in weeks. And with that, the world's relationship to knowledge changed forever. The monks had copied to preserve, the printers copied to distribute. The difference seems small, but it was a revolution in thought. In the scriptorium, a book was a relic, a singular object, irreplaceable and sacred. In the print shop, it became a product, identical, repeatable, endless. Where the monks' manuscripts carried the quiet individuality of the human hand, the printed page was impersonal, mechanical, efficient. The sacred turned secular. Still, the transition was not immediate. For a time, the two worlds coexisted. In the decades after Gutenberg, printers often hired former scribes to check proofs, design typefaces, or even hand-decorate printed books with initials and flourishes. The earliest printed works, called incunabula, literally cradled things, still resembled manuscripts. Their margins were wide, their fonts imitated Gothic handwriting. Some even left spaces for illuminators to paint in initials later, as if refusing to admit that the world had changed. Inside the monasteries, scriptoria gradually emptied. Some were repurposed into libraries, others into storage rooms. The monks' quills and inkwells gathered dust. Yet the habit of writing by hand did not vanish overnight. In smaller or poorer houses, the presses were distant rumors, and the old ways persisted. There are records of manuscripts still being copied in the early 1500s, long after printing had become widespread. These final copies feel different, slower, more nostalgic, as if the scribes knew they were performing a ritual rather than a necessity. One such manuscript, produced around 1520 at the Abbey of Tegernsee in Bavaria, bears a note from its scribe. "This work I write, though the world has no more need of my hand. It is both resignation and defiance, the awareness of obsolescence combined with the stubborn dignity of craft." The monks had always believed their work was eternal. Now they had to confront impermanence, not of ink, but of purpose. What happens to a vocation when the world no longer requires it? Some turned inward, finding solace in contemplation. Others turned outward, becoming teachers, confessors, or librarians. The work changed, but the devotion remained. Ironically, the same technology that displaced them also preserved their legacy. Printers eagerly copied the texts the monks had safeguarded for centuries. The first printed editions of Aristotle, Augustine, and the Bible all came from monastic manuscripts. The presses spread what the monks had saved. Their slowness had made speed possible. There is something profoundly human about that paradox, the patient work of one era becoming the fuel of the next. As the Renaissance unfolded, humanists began to celebrate the individuality of authorship, the signature, the ego, the personal voice. Yet in doing so, they moved away from the anonymity that had defined monastic writing. The monks had written not for self-expression, but for continuity. To them, the word was eternal, and the writer merely its vessel. The New Age reversed that balance. Now the name on the title page mattered more than the text itself. You can see the tension in the manuscripts that survive from this in-between time. Some include both printed and handwritten pages, hybrids of machine and man. In one remarkable example, a printed psalter from 1490 has been painstakingly hand-illuminated with gold and lapis blue. The result is almost absurd. Mass production made to look unique again. Humanity, it seems, could not give up the touch of the hand so easily. Meanwhile, monasteries faced decline. The Reformation in the early 16th century struck a mortal blow to many. Luther's followers, suspicious of monastic wealth and ritual, dissolved abbeys across Germany and England. Their libraries were scattered or destroyed. At Henry VIII's command, the dissolution of the monasteries 1536–151 emptied centuries of accumulation. Thousands of manuscripts vanished. Some were burned, others were sold by weight to bookbinders, who used their pages to reinforce newer books. In the bindings of early printed volumes, you can still find the ghosts of the monks' handwriting, fragments of psalms, sermons, and commentaries pressed invisibly between the covers. The survival of any manuscript feels miraculous in this context. Each one that endured did so by chance, rescued by a collector, forgotten in an attic, hidden in a chest. The Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Vatican Library, and others like them, became sanctuaries for these survivors. To walk through those halls today is to walk through the afterlife of the scriptorium. The air still carries the faint scent of parchment and oil, centuries-old silence made visible. Even as the art of copying faded, the ideal it represented, care, precision, devotion, found new forms. The early printers inherited the monks' sense of duty, if not their piety. Proofreaders became the new collators, typesetters the new scribes. The tools changed, but the anxiety about error remained. Printers corrected mistakes with the same fervor monks once did, issuing errata sheets to preserve textual purity. The ghost of the scriptorium lingered behind every press. And what of the manuscripts themselves? Over time, they began to take on a new kind of power, not as vessels of faith, but as symbols of authenticity. The printed book could be copied endlessly, but the handwritten manuscript was unique. Scholars prized it, collectors hoarded it. The very qualities that once made the monks' work dull, its slowness, its imperfection, became marks of reverence. In modern times, digital scanners and databases have taken up the monks' task. The scriptorium has become the server room. The light that once fell on vellum now glows from screens. Every word you read online, every document preserved in an archive, carries the same impulse, to save, to transmit, to resist forgetting. The difference is only speed. But speed changes meaning. When a monk copied a page, he saw each word, each letter, as an act of devotion. To reproduce something was to meditate on it, to make it part of oneself. In our age, copying is instantaneous, often mindless. We duplicate without absorbing. Perhaps, in the quiet of their cloisters, the monks understood something we've forgotten, that memory requires slowness. Their world was bounded by stone walls, candlelight, and silence. Ours is unbounded, electric, and noisy. Yet the goal is the same, to make thought endure beyond the mind that conceived it. Whether by quill, press, or pixel, we are still the same creatures, afraid of being forgotten. There is a small legend told about one anonymous scribe at the Abbey of Reichenau. It says that near the end of his life, after 50 years of copying, he grew too blind to write. But rather than retire, he asked to remain in the scriptorium. There he sat each day, listening to the younger monks at work. He could no longer see the words, but he could hear the rhythm of their quills scratching the parchment. That sound, he said, was the sound of time itself. It is fitting that the last scribes lived long enough to hear their echo in the printing press, a new rhythm, mechanical and relentless, yet born of the same desire. The torch had passed, but the flame was familiar. Today, when scholars open a 1,000-year-old manuscript and see the marks of a trembling hand, they are not just reading history, they are witnessing time slowed to its gentlest pace. Each blot of ink, each uneven margin, each faint smudge, is a reminder that civilization was built not only by brilliance, but by endurance. So when you close your eyes tonight, imagine that you are sitting in that dim, cold room. A quill in your hand, a candle beside you. The words you write will outlive you by centuries. You may never know who reads them, or why. You only know that the page must be filled before the light dies. You write slowly, carefully, letter by letter. The ink glistens. Somewhere, far in the future, someone turns that page and listens. In the silence between the strokes of the quill and the hum of the press, history is not noise, it is patience, made visible. And perhaps that is the final legacy of the monks who copied time, that slowness itself can be a kind of immortality. When you imagine a medieval monastery, you might think of prayer, candlelight, and the smell of old stone. But for the monks who spent their lives in the scriptorium, the sacred writing room, each day was governed by the slow pulse of ink and silence. There were no clocks, not as we know them, only the rhythm of the sun through high narrow windows and the steady scraping of quills against parchment. The work of copying a manuscript was less like writing and more like a kind of worship. Each letter had to be perfect, no smudges, no uneven spacing, no wavering lines. A single page could take days. A full Bible, copied by one monk, could take years. In an era before printing presses, or even widespread literacy, a single mistake could ruin a year's worth of work. Imagine the quiet pressure of that, the knowledge that every stroke of your hand must be flawless because parchment was precious, and correction meant scraping away the error with a knife. The faint marks of those scraped mistakes can still be seen today, like ghostly echoes of human imperfection. The monks' tools were simple but symbolic. They used quills made from the feathers of geese or swans, carefully cured and cut with small knives called penknives, the same kind that gave us the word pen. Ink was brewed from oak galls, those strange growths that form on trees when wasps lay their eggs in the bark. Mixed with iron salts and gum arabic, the ink would start a deep brown and darken to black as it dried. The scent of it was metallic and earthy, lingering in the cold air of the scriptorium like incense. Illuminators, the artists among them, added touches of color and gold. They ground pigments from minerals, lapis lazuli for blue, vermilion for red, and malachite for green. The gold leaf, so thin it fluttered like breath, was pressed carefully onto the page with a brush made from squirrel fur. It was not just decoration, it was theology in color and light. Every detail was meant to glorify God. But to the scribe, the act of creation was also a quiet rebellion against decay and time. The world outside the monastery walls changed, but within the scriptoria, the written word endured. Time for them did not move as it does for us. There were no deadlines, no instant results. Instead, there was the long, slow patience of devotion. A single monk might spend half a lifetime on one book. The pace was almost geological. Some historians have noted that certain scribes' handwriting changed subtly over the years, slower, heavier, more tremulous, as their eyes weakened and their hands aged. The books themselves became a kind of biography, recording not just holy words, but the quiet erosion of human flesh. Meals were simple and silent: bread, beans, a bit of cheese, maybe a thin ale. Talking was forbidden except in rare cases, and even then, monks often used hand signs to communicate. The scriptoria were unheated in winter, and the ink could freeze. Fingers went numb. Yet they continued, hunched over parchment by candlelight, breathing the faint smoke of tallow and beeswax. Each morning began with matins, the first of the canonical hours of prayer, often before dawn. The chants echoed in the stone halls, a haunting harmony that carried into the day's labor. After prayer, the scribes entered their narrow cubicles and began the slow rhythm again: dip, write, blot, breathe. The abbot would occasionally pass through the rows, inspecting the work. Some abbots were kind, others severe. One 12th century rulebook warned against scribes who write too fast and leave crooked letters as if their quill were on fire. Others complained of those who yawned too often, smudging the margins with drool or sweat. Yet even this monotony was sanctified. In the medieval mind, idleness was a sin, and copying a sacred text was one of the highest forms of labor: ora et labora, pray and work. It wasn't all solemn reverence, though. In the margins of many manuscripts, monks doodled. Tiny drawings of rabbits with swords, monks chasing snails, and strange beasts nibbling at letters still appear centuries later. These marginalia, as historians call them, reveal a different side of the scribes, a quiet humor born from long hours of repetition. Perhaps they were small rebellions, or simple expressions of weariness. Perhaps they were moments of humanity sneaking into divine work. There were also human errors that make these texts feel alive. In one manuscript, a monk wrote, "The hand is weary, the pen is blunt, the ink is scarce, the light is dim." In another, someone scrawled, "Thank God it will soon be dark." These little comments, tucked between lines of Latin scripture, are the whispers of men who spent lifetimes staring at parchment. The process of making the parchment itself was brutal. Skins of sheep, goats, or calves were soaked in lime water to remove hair, then stretched taut on frames and scraped clean with curved knives. It took skill to avoid tearing the fragile surface. The result was smooth, creamy vellum, capable of lasting centuries. Many of these pages outlived their creators by hundreds of years, surviving fires, wars, and reformations. The men who made them vanished into dust, but their words, carefully etched by candlelight, endured. To be a monk scribe was to exist between two worlds, the physical labor of writing and the spiritual act of devotion. It was a life of isolation, but also of connection, for each word linked them to a chain of knowledge stretching back to Rome and beyond. Even as Europe stumbled through plagues and wars, their scriptoria hummed quietly with the work of preservation. Without them, much of classical literature would have been lost. Still, their work exacted a toll. The repetitive posture, bent neck, cramped fingers, strained eyes, left many monks with chronic pain. Some developed what we'd now call scribe's palsy, a trembling in the hands that ended their ability to write. Others went blind. And yet, even as their bodies failed, they persisted. To stop was to betray both faith and purpose. Imagine the sound of it now, the scratching of a quill, the faint rustle of parchment, the distant tolling of a bell. The hours slip away unnoticed. Outside, seasons change. Inside, a monk finishes another letter. The same phrase repeated again and again, the same prayer whispered over each page. Centuries later, you can still trace his lines, still see where his hand trembled slightly, where he paused. He did not know that his work would survive into a world of machines, screens, and electric light. He wrote for God, and for the rhythm of the work itself. And in that rhythm, perhaps, there was a strange peace, a kind of meditation that blurred the boundary between time and eternity. As years passed, some of those monks grew old in the same seat they had taken as novices. Their faces wrinkled, their eyesight dimmed, and their bones ached from the cold stone floors. Yet their hands, those patient, ink-stained hands, continued their task. They were preserving more than words, they were preserving civilization, one letter at a time. And still, one wonders, in those endless hours of copying, did they ever question the value of their own labor? Did they ever look down at the fading lines of ink and wonder if anyone, centuries hence, would even care to read them? By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the scriptoria of Europe were dimly aware that the world beyond their cloisters was changing. The quiet age of hand-copied books was drawing to a close, though most of the monks did not yet know it. The change began not with a loud revolution, but with the steady click of metal letters in the hands of craftsmen far from the monastery's stone walls. The monasteries had long been the guardians of written knowledge. Every manuscript that survived from antiquity, Aristotle, Augustine, Cicero, Virgil, owed its existence to those patient scribes. In the stillness of the scriptoria, time had always moved at a sacred pace. But now, merchants, scholars, and explorers were hungry for speed. The Renaissance was stirring, cities were growing, and a new appetite for learning demanded more books than the monks could ever supply. Into that hunger stepped Johannes Gutenberg, a craftsman from Mainz in the Holy Roman Empire. Around 1450, he began his experiments with movable metal type, a seemingly simple idea that would dismantle centuries of quiet labor. Instead of carving each page by hand, Gutenberg used individual metal letters that could be rearranged, inked, and pressed onto paper. His machine could produce hundreds of pages in the time it took a monk to copy one. To the modern mind, this might seem a triumph of progress, but for the monks of the scriptoria, it must have felt like a kind of extinction. For nearly 1,000 years, copying texts had been their purpose, their act of devotion, their link to God. The printing press replaced their silence with clatter, their ritual with industry. Still, for a time, both worlds coexisted. Some monasteries adopted printing early, hiring lay printers to produce their texts more efficiently. Others resisted, believing that printed books lacked the sanctity of hand-copied scripture. Ink applied by a machine, they said, could never carry the same spiritual weight as words formed by a faithful hand. The transition wasn't immediate. Even as the first printed Bibles rolled off Gutenberg's press in 1455, monks were still bent over their desks in scriptoria from Ireland to Italy. Some of the last manuscripts from these centuries show a subtle shift, a merging of old and new. Margins began to include printed text with hand-painted illuminations, as if the two traditions were shaking hands across history. It was a short-lived peace. By the 16th century, the printing press had conquered Europe. Books flooded cities, universities, and homes. A Bible that once took years to produce could now be printed in weeks. For the first time, the written word was not confined to the church. Knowledge escaped the monasteries, spreading like wildfire through the streets of Florence, Paris, and London. It brought with it an age of learning, but it also brought noise. The slow, quiet rhythm of the quill gave way to the metallic rhythm of presses. Inside the monasteries, the scriptoria fell silent. Not with reverence this time, but with abandonment. Rooms once filled with the scratching of quills became storage for old tools and empty parchment frames. Candles no longer burned late into the night. Dust gathered on desks where once the word had been shaped letter by letter. Some monks took comfort in prayer. Others found new roles as teachers, librarians, or record keepers. But for those who had spent decades writing, the silence that followed was a strange kind of grief. To lose one's work to obsolescence is to lose a part of one's identity. And yet, the monks had always known that their task was not to be remembered, but to preserve. They were never meant to be the authors of history, only its caretakers. The irony, of course, is that without those centuries of slow copying, Gutenberg would have had little to print. The thousands of manuscripts preserved by monks became the foundation of the Renaissance and later the modern world. The press did not erase their work, it multiplied it. Every copy of every book printed in those first decades carried echoes of the scribe's steady hands. In a few places, like the Abbey of Monte Cassino in Italy or the monastery at Cluny in France, a few scriptoria continued for decades after the invention of the press. Some monks still preferred the old ways, seeing beauty in the imperfection of the hand. They copied not for demand, but for devotion. One scribe in the early 1500s, known only by the initials A.G. Gentrex, wrote in the margin of his final manuscript, "Now machines do our labor, the pen grows still." Imagine that final moment. The monk lays down his quill, the feather frayed, the ink dried, his hand trembles slightly. Not from age alone, but from knowing that he is the last of his kind. The candle burns low, he looks around the scriptorium, at the rows of empty desks, the dust collecting where his brothers once worked. The silence is total, but not peaceful. It is the silence after a long hymn ends. And yet, there is a quiet triumph in that ending. For though their world faded, their legacy endures in every page you turn, in every book that exists. The monks copied in darkness so that the light of knowledge would not die. Their lives were slow, sometimes painfully so, but through that slowness, they outwitted time. If you were to walk through the ruins of an old monastery today, perhaps in the soft light of evening, you might still feel the faint presence of their labor. The air would be cool, the stones smooth from centuries of footsteps. In a forgotten corner, you might even find a fragment of parchment, a single word still legible. The ink faded, the hand unknown. But that word, written in silence hundreds of years ago, would still speak. It would say that slowness has its own kind of power, that patience can preserve civilizations, that even the smallest act, done with devotion, can ripple across centuries. And perhaps, if you listened long enough, you might hear it whisper, softly, steadily, like the sound of a quill on parchment, reminding you that the quiet hands of history never truly stop moving. You stand before a cathedral, its towers climb so high that your neck aches as you tilt your head back to see the spires disappear into cloud. The air smells faintly of stone dust, damp lime, and centuries. It's easy to forget that every curve of the arch, every block in the wall, and every gargoyle's sneering face was once lifted by hand. What you see before you is not a building so much as a fossil of human patience. A monument that took generations to build, outlasting its creators again and again. The story of medieval cathedrals begins in the 12th century, during the High Middle Ages, when Europe's great cities, Paris, Chartres, Canterbury, Cologne, decided to reach for heaven. They didn't yet have the tools for such ambition. No machines, no cranes as we know them, no engines of iron and steam. What they had were ropes, pulleys, muscle, mathematics, and faith. The cathedrals that rose from these were the skyscrapers of their time, yet they grew slower than trees. At the heart of it all was the master mason. He was not a priest or a nobleman, but a craftsman, a hybrid of engineer, artist, and architect. He carried knowledge passed down orally, secrets of geometry and proportion learned through apprenticeship, not textbooks. His plans weren't drawn on paper but scratched into plastered tracing floors inside temporary wooden huts near the construction site. Those lines, carefully scribed in chalk, were the hidden blueprints of eternity.
Timbuktu, a city on the edge of the Sahara, is famous for its golden sand, sun-scorched streets, and the bustling trade of salt, gold, and manuscripts. Yet hidden among its mud brick mosques and bustling marketplaces is another treasure, The work of scribes, men and women who dedicate their lives to copying texts by hand. Each page they produce is a labor of patience and precision, a delicate act of preservation in a world where survival itself can be precarious. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu became a hub of Islamic scholarship. Libraries of manuscripts, many brought from across West Africa and the Islamic world, housed knowledge ranging from theology and law to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and poetry. But books were rare, fragile, and vulnerable to decay, theft, or fire. Scribes emerged as essential guardians of this knowledge, tasked with copying manuscripts carefully, ensuring that information survived for future generations. The work begins with materials. Parchment or paper must be prepared, ink mixed from soot or plant extracts, and quills trimmed to precise points. The scribe's tools are deceptively simple: a knife for sharpening, a ruler for margins, and the inkpot that holds the carefully prepared liquid. Yet simplicity belies the skill required. Every stroke must be deliberate. A slip could ruin a page, a chapter, or an entire manuscript. Patience is not optional, it is essential. Apprenticeship is a slow, exacting process. Young students spend months learning the shapes of letters, the spacing of words, and the correct order of copying texts. Early lessons involve tracing letters and practicing calligraphy. Once basic skills are mastered, the apprentice begins copying simple texts under close supervision. Over years, they progress to entire manuscripts, learning how to maintain consistent ink flow, proper alignment, and clarity of script. Each page is a test of endurance, focus, and precision. Scribes work in quiet, dimly lit spaces, often seated on mats or low benches, with manuscripts stacked carefully nearby. They copy in silence, mindful of every stroke, aware that the knowledge they preserve is fragile. The process is slow. One manuscript can take months to complete, and the work is repetitive, physically demanding, and mentally exhausting. Yet the scribes endure, motivated by devotion, the importance of their task, and the understanding that each page they complete safeguards centuries of thought. The manuscripts themselves are more than text, they are cultural and historical artifacts. Diagrams of astronomical calculations, treatises on medicine, and collections of poetry reflect a vibrant intellectual life that flourished despite geographic isolation and the harsh environment of the Sahara. Each copied manuscript ensures continuity. Knowledge is not lost to time, war, or neglect. The scribe's labor turns fragile paper into a vessel of resilience, a bridge between past, present, and future. Guilds or informal networks often organize scribes, regulating who may copy particular texts and ensuring that standards are maintained. Accuracy is paramount. A miscopied word can change meaning, alter calculations, or distort legal principles. Scribes develop systems for verification, rereading pages, and cross-checking references to maintain fidelity. Their work is methodical, slow, and precise, requiring not just skill, but integrity and a careful mind. Scribes' work is physically demanding. Long hours hunched over manuscripts, strained backs and eyes, ink stains hands and clothing. Dust from paper, sand, and soot lingers in the air. The monotony, combined with the fragility of the materials, creates a delicate tension. One lapse in focus can ruin a manuscript that may have taken months to complete. Yet every completed page carries significance far beyond the scribe's immediate labor, preserving knowledge that might otherwise vanish into the desert sands. Despite the importance of their work, scribes are often anonymous. Libraries fill with pages signed only by initials or left unsigned altogether. The knowledge they preserve, the mathematics, astronomy, medicine, theology, reaches scholars far beyond Timbuktu, shaping education and thought across West Africa and beyond. Yet the labor itself remains largely invisible, a quiet dedication to the continuity of human intellect. As you picture a scribe sitting in the soft light of a Timbuktu library, quill in hand,
tracing words carefully onto a fragile page, one question emerges: how many centuries of knowledge, discoveries, and ideas might have been lost if not for the patient, meticulous, and largely unseen labor of scribes who devoted their lives to writing one page at a time? In the quiet corners of Timbuktu's libraries, apprentices learn the rhythm of a scribe's life. Young boys and sometimes girls begin by tracing letters, practicing calligraphy, and learning the correct proportions and spacing of Arabic script. These initial lessons are slow and repetitive, often requiring weeks or months before the apprentice can attempt copying even a single sentence independently. The work demands discipline, focus, and a patience that is cultivated daily. Once foundational skills are established, apprentices progress to copying complete pages under the watchful eyes of masters. Ink must be prepared with precision. Soot mixed with gum arabic or plant-based dyes carefully measured and diluted to achieve consistent flow. Quills or reed pens are sharpened to fine points, allowing for fluid, controlled strokes. The process is methodical. Margins are measured, spacing is calculated, and every word is double-checked for accuracy. Mistakes are not easily corrected, so concentration is paramount. Scribes employ various techniques to ensure precision. Pages are numbered, sections cross-referenced, and previously copied texts are constantly consulted. Corrections are made with care, using scraping tools to remove ink without damaging the delicate surface. Each manuscript is reviewed multiple times, often by different hands, before it is considered complete. Accuracy is not just a matter of pride, it is essential for preserving knowledge that might be applied in religious instruction, law, medicine, or astronomy. The apprentice's labor extends beyond mere copying. They also learn to prepare materials, maintain libraries, and store manuscripts safely. Parchment and paper are sensitive to humidity, and light improper storage can result in decay or ink fading. The preparation of ink, the handling of delicate pages, and the organization of manuscripts are all integral to the scribe's role, ensuring that knowledge survives both the elements and human error. Timbuktu's scribes are part of informal networks, exchanging manuscripts with scholars in other regions, copying texts requested by students, and preserving works that would otherwise vanish. These networks ensure that knowledge is not isolated within one library or household, but shared, replicated, and preserved for generations. A single lost manuscript could mean the disappearance of valuable astronomical tables, medical knowledge, or historical records, hence the meticulous care taken in every step of the process. The physical demands of the work are significant. Scribes spend hours hunched over manuscripts, eyes fixed on the tiny script, hands steady, breathing controlled. The repetition strains muscles and vision, and the monotony tests patience and focus. Yet each completed page is a testament to endurance, skill, and dedication, contributing to a legacy that extends far beyond the individual scribe. Beyond technical skill, the work shapes culture and society. Manuscripts support education, legal decisions, religious instruction, and scientific inquiry. A single manuscript copied accurately can serve as the foundation for knowledge in medicine, astronomy, or law for an entire community. The labor of scribes ensures continuity. Ideas, discoveries, and insights are preserved, transmitted, and built upon, creating a cumulative effect that strengthens the intellectual fabric of Timbuktu and West Africa. Scribes are also moral and intellectual guardians. In societies where knowledge was scarce and books precious, maintaining the integrity of a manuscript was paramount. Altering a text intentionally could mislead future scholars or distort religious or legal interpretations. The scribe's responsibility is immense. Accuracy, care, and diligence are ethical as well as practical obligations. Every stroke of ink represents a commitment to truth, continuity, and collective memory. And yet, despite their profound importance, scribes remain largely anonymous. Their names may be recorded on a colophon or omitted entirely. They labor quietly, often in solitude, yet their influence stretches far beyond the library walls. The survival of knowledge, the advancement of science, and the continuity of culture in Timbuktu owe everything to these meticulous, patient, and largely invisible artisans. As you imagine an apprentice carefully aligning letters on a fragile page, the ink flowing steadily from a sharpened quill, one thought lingers. How many centuries of learning, scientific discovery, and cultural insight have endured only because of the quiet, repetitive, and painstaking labor of scribes who preserved knowledge one page at a time? The libraries of Timbuktu, lined with countless manuscripts, are silent witnesses to centuries of meticulous labor. Each page, a product of patience, precision, and devotion, preserves knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to the desert sands, war, or neglect. The scribes whose names often remain unknown ensured that generations of scholars, merchants, and rulers could access the accumulated wisdom of West Africa and the wider Islamic world. Their work is both fragile and enduring, delicate in material but resilient in its impact. The influence of these manuscripts extends beyond their immediate locale. Texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and theology circulated across West Africa, informing education and civic life. Legal scholars referenced carefully copied treaties and religious texts to resolve disputes. Physicians consulted manuscripts to treat patients. Astronomers used tables and calculations to track stars and predict lunar cycles. Knowledge preserved by scribes shaped both practical and intellectual life, allowing society to function with a continuity rarely acknowledged in history. Scribes also ensured the survival of cultural identity. Poetry, oral histories, genealogies, and stories of local kingdoms were transcribed, transforming oral traditions into enduring written records. These manuscripts allowed ideas, customs, and values to survive long after the individuals who created them were gone. In this sense, the scribes were not merely recorders, they were curators of memory, weaving together the threads of past and present. Preservation was a constant concern. Manuscripts faced threats from heat, humidity, sand, insects, and human error. Scribes developed strategies for storage. Manuscripts were bound, stacked carefully, and sometimes wrapped in protective cloth. Libraries were built to shield documents from sun and wind. Copies were made when necessary, ensuring that even if one manuscript was lost, another would survive. The labor involved in maintaining this intellectual infrastructure was ongoing, repetitive, and often invisible. The work of scribes created ripples far beyond Timbuktu. European scholars, centuries later, recognized the wealth of knowledge preserved in West African manuscripts, influencing understandings of medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. The painstaking labor of scribes ensured that African scholarship, often ignored in traditional narratives, survived and could be appreciated by future generations. Their work is a quiet testament to the universality and longevity of human knowledge, transcending time, geography, and circumstance. Physically, the labor was grueling. Hours spent hunched over fragile pages, strained eyes, backs, and hands. Ink-stained skin and clothing, and the repetitive motions of writing were exhausting. Yet the scribes endured, motivated by devotion, respect for knowledge, and the understanding that each page completed was a safeguard against ignorance and loss. The slow, repetitive nature of the work, combined with its precision, created a rhythm that structured their days and anchored their lives in purpose. Even with the advent of modern printing and digital technology, the manuscripts of Timbuktu retain their significance. They remind us that knowledge is fragile, effort-intensive, and deeply human. The scribe's labor underscores a truth that often goes unnoticed. The survival of ideas, culture, and civilization depends not just on discovery or invention, but on the patient, meticulous work of those who preserve what has already been learned. As you picture a scribe, quill in hand, slowly tracing letters across a fragile page in a dimly lit library, one thought lingers. How much of human knowledge, understanding, and culture exists today only because of the quiet, painstaking work of individuals whose lives were dedicated to writing, copying, and preserving the fragile vessels of wisdom. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, preserved against the odds, are silent testaments to human resilience, intellect, and dedication. They demonstrate that the most enduring contributions to civilization often come from patient, repetitive labor rather than grand spectacle, and that the continuity of knowledge relies as much on guardianship as on discovery. Imagine a village in medieval Europe, somewhere between the misty hills of England or the river valleys of France. The sun rises over fields of golden wheat, rye, and barley, and the air carries the faint scent of damp earth and growing grain. At the heart of this agrarian society stands the mill, a simple building, often made of timber or stone, where water or wind drives massive wooden gears and grinding stones. Here the miller performs a task both ordinary and essential, turning harvested grain into flour, the foundation of human survival. Millers occupy a peculiar position in medieval society. Villagers rely on them for sustenance, for without flour, bread, the staple of the medieval diet, would not exist. Yet millers are often distrusted, accused of short-changing, adulterating grain, or overcharging for their services. Despite such suspicions, their labor is indispensable, mediating between harvest and hunger, field and table. The work begins with grain brought from nearby fields. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats arrive in sacks or baskets, each kernel representing months of cultivation under the uncertain blessing of sun, rain, and soil fertility. The miller must first inspect the grain, removing stones, debris, or damaged kernels. Clean grain is essential, as impurities can dull the millstones, produce poor quality flour, or even spoil the batch. Precision is the first skill of the miller, an understated but crucial quality. Water mills are common in regions with flowing rivers or streams. A wooden wheel, turned by the force of moving water, transfers motion to gears and grinding stones inside the mill. Windmills, more prevalent in open plains, rely on blades capturing the wind's energy, channeling it to turn similar mechanisms. Regardless of the energy source, the miller's job is to monitor the machinery, adjust its speed, and maintain the grinding stone's alignment. One small miscalculation can produce flour that is too coarse, too fine, or overheated, affecting its baking quality. The process of grinding is repetitive and physically demanding. Large sacks of grain must be moved, the stones monitored for friction and wear, and the resulting flour collected and bagged. In watermills, the constant roar of rushing water fills the building, masking other sounds and creating a rhythmic background to the labor. In windmills, the motion of the sails and the creaking of wooden gears dominate the space. The miller must remain vigilant, maintaining machinery, controlling the flow of grain, and ensuring that the output meets the village's needs. Apprentices assist the master miller, learning the trade through repetition. They sweep the floors, repair sacks, monitor stone surfaces, and adjust grain flow. Their training is slow, millers are precise, teaching by demonstration, correction, and repetition. Understanding the nuances of milling, the correct grain-to-stone ratio, the moisture content of grain, the speed of grinding, is not intuitive and takes years to master. In this labor, patience is as critical as strength. Millers also maintain knowledge of local conditions, seasonal variations, river levels, wind patterns, and grain quality all affect their work. They develop intuitive systems to anticipate these changes, adjusting millstones' distance for humidity, predicting water flow during dry spells, and estimating how much grain the mill can process in a day. Their labor is both manual and intellectual, combining repetitive physical action with careful observation and planning. Despite the essential nature of their work, millers often exist on the margins socially. They handle wealth, the grain itself is a form of currency, but their interactions with villagers can be tense, framed by mistrust and necessity. Yet for all the gossip or suspicion, life in the village hinges on their labor. Bread is central to survival, flour is the link between the earth and the human body. Every loaf depends on the slow, deliberate efforts of the miller, whose hands shape the sustenance of the community. As you picture the miller at the grinding stones, hands dusted with flour, listening to the constant roar of water or the creak of sails, one question arises. How much of human survival, daily sustenance, and community stability in medieval Europe depended entirely on the patient, repetitive, and largely invisible labor of millers, whose work turned grain into life itself? The medieval mill is more than a building, it is a hub of life, a rhythm around which the village organizes itself. Millers, though often uncelebrated, are central to this rhythm, translating harvest into sustenance. Apprenticeships begin early, often with boys barely in their teens, who are bound to master millers for years. Their training is long, repetitive, and physically demanding, but it is also essential for the survival of the community. Apprentices begin with basic tasks, sweeping the floors, carrying grain, and observing the operation of millstones. They learn how to gauge the grain's quality, detect stones or impurities, and measure moisture levels, all of which affect the milling process. Gradually they progress to operating machinery, adjusting the millstones, monitoring water or wind power, and regulating the flow of grain. The work is painstaking. A single misalignment or oversight could ruin a day's production, wasting both grain and labor. Technological refinements quietly transform the work over decades. Watermills and windmills evolve from simple stone and wood constructions to more efficient mechanisms with geared systems, sluices, and adjustable sails or water channels. Innovations like the use of multiple pairs of stones allow mills to grind more grain simultaneously, while improved gearing ensures more consistent results. Each incremental improvement reduces labor intensity and increases output, though the process remains repetitive and demanding. The miller's work extends beyond physical labor. They maintain machinery, repair wooden gears, sharpen millstones, and ensure that the mill operates efficiently. Water levels must be monitored, wind directions gauged, and gears lubricated to prevent wear. Knowledge of local weather, river behavior, and seasonal variations is essential. A skilled miller can anticipate changes that might affect production, adjusting their work to ensure a continuous supply of flour to the village. Millers are also economic intermediaries. Grain brought to the mill often functions as a form of rent or tax, and millers may receive a portion of the grain as payment. They thus handle the community's sustenance and wealth, balancing fairness and necessity. Despite their importance, millers occupy a socially ambivalent position. Villagers rely on them, yet rumors of cheating or shortchanging are common. Their labor, meticulous and essential, is both respected and mistrusted, making it simultaneously central and invisible. Apprentices' daily lives are structured around repetition. They walk the length of the mill floor, adjust stones, measure grain, and sweep debris. Each action, repeated hundreds of times, builds skill and endurance. Over time, the rhythm of labor becomes internalized. The grinding stone's vibration, the sound of rushing water, or the creak of sails guide their movements. Mastery is measured not in brilliance but in consistency, vigilance, and the ability to maintain quality over long hours. The mill is also a site of community life. Villagers congregate, exchanging news, goods, and gossip while waiting for their grain. Yet despite this social interaction, the work inside remains largely solitary. The miller and apprentices focus on process and precision, often in near silence, attentive to the subtleties of machinery, grain quality, and environmental conditions. This combination of repetitive labor and constant vigilance mirrors the slow, steady heartbeat of the village itself. Technological and procedural refinements influence wider society. More efficient milling supports larger populations, allows for storage and trade of surplus flour, and enables economic growth beyond immediate subsistence. Each sack of flour produced under the careful hands of the miller contributes to stability, trade, and the resilience of the community. The quiet work of grinding grain becomes a linchpin of medieval survival, bridging natural resources, human labor, and societal organization. Even with the laborious and repetitive nature of their work, millers find satisfaction in their craft. A properly ground batch of flour, smooth, consistent, and free of impurities, represents both skill and service to the community. Though rarely celebrated, this achievement ensures survival, strengthens economic networks, and maintains social order. The seemingly boring labor of repetitive grinding has consequences far beyond the mill floor. It sustains life itself. As you picture an apprentice walking the mill floor, adjusting stones, monitoring water flow, and observing the master's precise hands, one thought arises. How many lives, communities, and social structures depended entirely on the slow, repetitive, and largely invisible labor of millers, whose daily toil transformed grain into both sustenance and stability. Medieval millers, working quietly at watermills and windmills, were more than operators of machinery, they were the custodians of life itself. Every sack of grain transformed into flour was a step toward survival, stability, and continuity. The rhythm of the mill dictated the rhythm of the village. The grinding stones, the flow of water, the creak of gears all became the heartbeat of daily life. Yet the labor of millers, so essential to society, remained largely invisible to those who depended on it. The impact of millers extended far beyond nourishment. Flour, the product of their patient labor, was a form of currency, a trade commodity, and a measure of wealth. It enabled local markets to function, supported bakers and brewers, and allowed surplus to be stored or transported. This in turn contributed to the growth of towns, the development of trade networks, and the stability of feudal societies. Without millers, the flow of goods and sustenance would have faltered, leaving communities vulnerable to famine and economic instability. Millers also influenced social and legal structures. Villages often depended on communal mills, and guilds or local authorities regulated the work. Disputes over grain measurement, quality, and payment were common, and the miller was central to resolving or managing these conflicts. In this way, the miller was simultaneously a laborer, technician, and mediator, roles that intertwined with law, commerce, and community life. Their work helped sustain not only the body, but also social cohesion. The physical and mental demands of milling were unrelenting. Long hours hunched over stones, monitoring water flow or wind, adjusting mechanisms, and handling heavy sacks shaped the lives of millers. Apprentices learned to endure repetition, develop vigilance, and combine observation with physical labor. Over years, repetitive motion became skill, and skill became expertise, yet the labor remained monotonous, requiring both patience and focus. It was through this combination of endurance and attention that millers preserved the food security of entire communities. Technological refinement quietly enhanced productivity over generations. Watermills evolved with improved gearing, sluices, and multiple pairs of millstones. Windmills became more efficient with adjustable sails and better designed internal mechanics. These innovations, though subtle, increased output, reduced physical strain, and allowed communities to support larger populations. Every innovation was built upon centuries of repetition, observation, and problem-solving, testament to the quiet intelligence of millers who labored day after day. The legacy of medieval millers is both material and cultural. Flour enabled the sustenance of communities, the stability of economies, and the growth of towns. The rhythm of their work structured village life, shaped social hierarchies, and facilitated trade. Millers ensured continuity across generations. Each day's grind connected harvest to meal, labor to survival, and village to region. Their labor, repetitive and often unremarkable in appearance, formed the backbone of medieval society. Even today, the principles established by medieval millers resonate. The division of labor, the integration of technology with human skill, and the reliance on patient, repetitive work as a foundation for survival and society are concepts that underpin modern industry and agriculture. The mills themselves, often preserved as historical sites, stand as reminders of the quiet, essential labor that once sustained entire civilizations. As you picture a miller walking the length of a watermill, adjusting stones, and listening to the rhythmic roar of flowing water, one thought remains. How many generations survived, thrived, or even built civilizations because of the patient, repetitive, and largely invisible labor of millers, whose hands transformed humble grains into the foundation of life itself? Imagine a city in medieval Europe after dusk. Narrow cobblestone streets, winding between timber-framed houses, the air scented faintly with smoke, wood, and earth. Darkness settles quickly, and survival, work, and ritual all depend on light. In this world, the candle maker's craft is essential, though often overlooked. Candles illuminate homes, workshops, churches, and public spaces, allowing daily life to continue beyond daylight, and the artisans who produce them toil in quiet, repetitive labor that sustains civilization's rhythm. Candle making is deceptively simple in theory. Wax is melted, wicks inserted, and forms cooled. In practice, it is exacting and time-consuming. Wax, usually tallow from rendered animal fat, or, for the wealthy, beeswax, must be cleaned, clarified, and sometimes scented. Wicks, often made from linen or cotton, require careful twisting and trimming to ensure steady burning. The candle maker balances temperature, thickness, and wick placement. One small error can result in uneven burning, dripping, or extinguishing, which could render a candle useless. Apprenticeships shape the craft. Young workers begin by preparing wax and wicks, cleaning molds, and assisting masters with basic pouring. Their early tasks are repetitive and seemingly mundane, but each step teaches control, patience, and precision. Over months and years they progress to handling molten wax, aligning wicks, and producing uniform candles that meet the rigorous standards of households, guilds, and churches. The process is painstaking. A single batch can take days from start to finish. Candle production varies by purpose. Small, simple tallow candles illuminate homes and workshops. Beeswax candles, smoother and cleaner burning, are reserved for religious ceremonies, guild halls, or wealthy patrons. Each type requires specialized knowledge. Tallow, for instance, burns unevenly and can produce smoke or odor, so wax must be refined carefully. Beeswax must be heated to the correct temperature to avoid cracking or bubbling. Every candle embodies hours of repetitive, careful labor, yet the work is largely invisible to those who benefit. The candle maker's workshop is a world of heat, scent, and concentration. Apprentices stand near vats of molten wax, pouring slowly, trimming wicks, and monitoring the cooling forms. The master moves between stations, demonstrating techniques, correcting mistakes, and ensuring quality. Repetition dominates the day, pouring, setting, trimming, reheating, and inspecting. Every task must be performed with steady hands and a focused mind, and every misstep can waste precious material or compromise the candle's usefulness. Candles also shape urban life. Streets are illuminated, enabling late markets, social gatherings, and safe passage. Churches rely on candles for worship and ceremonies, giving light to rituals that would otherwise be shrouded in darkness. Domestic households depend on candles to extend productive hours, allowing reading, sewing, and cooking after sunset. In this sense, candle makers wield a quiet influence, shaping the rhythms, safety, and culture of city life through repetitive, meticulous labor. Guilds regulate candle making in many cities. Standards of quality, pricing, and apprenticeship are carefully monitored. Masters maintain the knowledge of wax preparation, pouring techniques, and wick alignment, passing skills to the next generation. Guild oversight ensures reliability, preserves trade secrets, and protects livelihoods. In these ways, the work of candle makers is not only craft, but also an institution, quietly sustaining both urban economy and social order. The labor is physically demanding. Standing near heat, handling heavy wax, and performing repetitive motions strains the body. Hands become stiff and calloused, eyes tired from close inspection of molten wax and wicks. The work is monotonous, yet every candle represents safety, productivity, and illumination. Each one allows people to work, study, worship, and socialize after dark, making the invisible labor of candle makers indispensable to urban life. As you picture apprentices pouring wax, wicks held straight, the workshop filled with warmth and scent, one thought lingers. How many nights of reading, prayer, work, or conversation were made possible by the slow, repetitive, and largely unseen labor of candle makers, whose hands extended human activity into the darkness? In a medieval candle workshop, apprentices learned the rhythm of the craft through repetition,